There are many histories written of this isle. Histories of the Celts, the Vikings, our learned monks, of rebellion and civil war. But there is, in these histories, a conspicuous absence of a group whose members have played an instrumental role in shaping the country over the past 3 centuries, the Freemasons. Ireland has a long and much storied association with Freemasonry. One of the oldest Freemason artifacts to be found anywhere is the Ballsbridge Square, which was discovered in Limerick, Ireland, in 1830 and dates back to 1507. The second oldest recorded Masonic Grand Lodge in the world, and oldest in continuous existence, was established in Dublin in 1725, and many of the most influential men in Irish, and indeed world history, were Freemasons. Their members have been remembered in our street names, our banknotes, and public monuments, both in Ireland and throughout the world. Freemasonry, as viewed by the general public, is seen as a mysterious, somewhat shadowy organization. Freemasons, however, point to the tenets of the craft and insist that the fraternity exists to improve the lot of humankind. However, when one delves into Freemasonry's past, it quickly becomes clear that its history is obscure at times, controversial, and much contested, even between Freemasons themselves. In terms of its origins, Freemasonry, as we know it today, emerged in the early 18th century. However, some would point to the esoteric knowledge of ancient Egypt and the rituals and teachings of its mystery schools, as well as those of classical Greece and Rome, for the origins of what we know today as Freemasonry. Others would point to their origins in Jerusalem and the building of the Temple of Solomon by Hiram Abip for King Solomon, while others would even say that it was the Knights Templar, veterans of the Crusades in the Holy Land, whose base in Jerusalem was situated on the Temple Mount, the site where the Temple of Solomon once stood, who introduced the roots of modern Freemasonry to Scotland after the Templar Order was disbanded by royal and papal decree throughout Europe in 1307. Most would agree that the stonemasons' guilds, which emerged in Europe during the Middle Ages, and who were responsible for the construction of the great cathedrals at which we still marvel today, were precursors to the formation of the Grand Lodges, which began to appear in the 17th century. But even that is disputed. What is not disputed is the fact that since the formation of the Grand Lodges, many individuals on the rolls of Freemasonry have had an instrumental influence on Irish and Western world affairs. Its ranks boast royalty and revolutionaries, military generals and artists, presidents and philosophers. The current monarch of Britain, Queen Elizabeth II's cousin, Edward, Duke of Kent, is the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, as was her father. And historically, there have been many links between Freemasonry and the British Crown. 4 of the last 5 kings have been Freemasons. 23 princes of the royal family have been Freemasons, including 8 who were Grand Masters of England. George Washington and many of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons, as were many of the figures behind the French Revolution and the Irish Rebellion of 1798.
Robert Walpole, regarded as Britain's first Prime Minister, and Louis Adolphe Thiers, who became first President of the Third French Republic, were Freemasons. Simón Bolívar, who played a pivotal role in the establishment of Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia as sovereign states. Giuseppe Garibaldi, considered as one of the fathers of Italian unification, and José Rizal, national hero of the Philippines.
Composers like Mozart, famous authors like Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling, and immortal entertainers like Harry Houdini, Charlie Chaplin, Nat King Cole, John Wayne, and Stanley Kubrick were all fellow brothers.
In modern history, men like Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain during World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was President of the United States at the beginning of the war, and his successor, Harry Truman, who was in office during the war's conclusion and the dropping of the atomic bomb. All were Freemasons. J. Edgar Hoover, who founded the FBI, and Allen Dulles, who became the first civilian director of the CIA and its longest-serving director to date.
Many of Ireland's most famous sons were Freemasons. Both of the men termed the uncrowned King of Ireland, Daniel O'Connell, and after him, Charles Stewart Parnell, were Freemasons. James Hoban, the man who designed the White House, was an Irish Freemason. The Duke of Wellington, the man much credited as the greatest general in British military history, was born in Ireland and was an Irish Freemason. The Duke of Leinster, Edmund Burke. Jonathan Swift, who was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, and also wrote Gulliver's Travels, was also a Freemason, as was his fellow wordsmith, Oscar Wilde, who was briefly part of the order while at Oxford. Even Irish revolutionaries like Henry Joy McCracken and Lord Edward Fitzgerald were on the square, while also James Wilson left Freemasonry to establish the Orange Order. Due to the secretive nature of the fraternity, it is difficult to trace the origins of Freemasonry into Ireland. Indeed, many of the most learned of Freemasons appear not to be 100% sure or unanimous on the exact origins in Ireland, or indeed anywhere. Some would say that it came to Ireland as far back as the Norman invasion under Strongbow. Others would say that the basic ritual system came from the operative stonemasons.
Where did the Freemasons come from? It's one that no one's really been able to actually answer. It's probable that Freemasonry came from about 20 different things. Whether it actually came from the original stonemasons who were building castles and cathedrals in the Dark Ages, it's kind of anyone's guess. We're more than likely related to them somehow, but no one really knows how or why or when that actually happened. I kind of lean towards the idea that we copied them. But then in about the, say, mid to late 1600s, this fraternity that we have now started to appear based on those original stonemasons one way or another. So it got its legs really in the Enlightenment period as a secular fraternity, a pluralist society, if you want. I prefer to use the term pluralist. A fraternity for any man who believes in any higher power. That's what we really are. And it's what we've always been really since the beginning of the Enlightenment period.
It's hard to put a date on when Freemasonry actually began. We know that they started keeping accurate records, minutes of meetings and so forth, around 1700. Prior to that, there seems to be evidence of their existence. For example, Sir Christopher Wren, who was the architect in the court of Charles II, built St. Paul's Cathedral, seems to have been a Freemason. But it would seem that around 1700, these lodges, which had maybe informally been meeting for decades, began to formalize and create charters for themselves, had a central body that gave license to them.
Freemasonry. Some scholars date it back to the building of the Temple of Solomon and the story of Hiram Abiff. Others point to the Knights Templar, while many would argue that Freemasonry, as we know today, began with the creation of the Grand Lodge. Could you please give some understanding of the origins of Freemasonry, touching, if you can, on the possible starting points mentioned?
Freemasonry is originating from an old traditional craft, the stonemasons. I see the origin of Freemasonry in the lodges, which were the lean-to structures on cathedral building sites. Those lodges were workshops where the stonemasons kept their tools and where they met, where they discussed, and where they made their drawings and plans for the building. This is the origin of masonry, what we call craft masonry. Craft being stonemasons or masons craft. King Solomon's Temple is a symbol within craft masonry. Even the old craft lodges in the Middle Ages had symbolism. I saw recently a film about the cathedral in Cologne, which is still under construction. It is under repair. And they have also lodges, not Masonic lodges, but workshops to restore or to repair the whole building. And those lodges, both in Middle Ages and also today, had some stories or contents, and that was King Solomon's Temple. They said, where was building and craft coming from? It was the main big building at those times, but King Solomon's times, a magnificent building in Jerusalem, which was unique in those times, and not only Solomon was involved, but also architects from neighboring countries. And when you mention Hiram Abiff was an architect from the neighboring, from the Lebanon, a Phoenician. And the Phoenician architecture was deriving from the Egyptian architecture. When you see Phoenician temples, they resemble very much Egyptian temples. So all this knowledge of building, of big, vast buildings, came from old times and were used also in the medieval ages during the construction of cathedrals and castles and bridges and so on. And that's where the origin of craft masonry is coming. And we follow those traditions. We have similar tools which the old masons used before: square, compass, chisel, hammer, and so on. But we put a symbol on it for our own life.
Century, when modern Freemasonry begins, they borrowed a lot from the Guild of Freemasons. The Guild of Freemasons was a sort of trade union, if you will, of people who went around building things like castles and cathedrals. Now, unlike other trades, like, say, silversmiths, goldsmiths, or carpenters, they moved around. In most medieval cities, the guilds were expected to stay in one place. So if your grandfather was a goldsmith, you were likely one as well. And the stonemasons were a different body altogether because they had to move around. Not only did they have to move around, they had to then go to a building site and stay there for several generations. I think Chartres Cathedral, for example, took over 100 years to build. And the freestone masons, and that's what they were. The freestone mason was somebody who did all the fine carving and embellishments of the stone. They just didn't put one brick on top of another. Because of the fact that they often came from different lands, couldn't even speak the language, how do you tell whether an individual is qualified to do the work? And in those days, you didn't show up with a degree in engineering and say, look. So they evidently evolved a series of secret signs, passwords, handshakes, which would show at what level of stone cutting you were at. So we still have those things. Because there's another aspect of Freemasonry, which is the fact that it was always a very liberal organization. One might argue a radical one. Because you go back to the 17th century and you would get up in the marketplace and say, look, all people who believe in something are probably okay. People of goodwill have a lot in common. So Jews, Muslims, Christians of all denomination have more in common than they don't. Now, this would have been enough to probably send you to prison, if not worse. As a result, people who banded together, who shared those notions, had to keep it secret. And they seem to have taken on the secrecy of the old Freemasonry guilds in order to do this. Now, nowadays, of course, probably no reason for it anymore. But let's say, for example, many of the people involved in the American War of Independence were Freemasons. George Washington, the first president of the United States, Benjamin Franklin, the great intellectual, Thomas Paine, who wrote pamphlets defending the right of the American colonies to succeed. These were all Freemasons, and a large percentage of the people who signed both the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and those who signed the original American Constitution were Freemasons. And both of those documents are couched in terms which are taken out of liberal Freemasonry ideas, that divine right of kings has no place, that all human beings have a validity, that all human beings should be treated with compassion. Nowadays, we would accept that.
The Grand Lodge of Ireland is the governing body of Irish Freemasonry, and today consists of hundreds of associated lodges located throughout not only Ireland, but in many places throughout the world, whose warrants come from the Grand Lodge of Ireland and are therefore under its jurisdiction. There is no record of the exact date of the establishment of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. The earliest known record is of a meeting, 1725, by the Dublin Weekly Journal, which recorded a meeting of the Grand Lodge of Ireland to install the new Grand Master, the first Earl of Ross.
This is Grand Lodge of Ireland. This is the HQ, if you want. This is the governing body of all Irish Freemasonry. Now, in this particular building, the Grand Lodge of Ireland meets. It's the home of Grand Lodge, but also about 34 lodges of Freemasons meet here as well and rent these rooms, aside from lots of other Masonic things. So, as I mentioned to you before, this building is not a lodge. This is just a building. A lodge is a collective noun of Freemasons. So this is the home of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, the administrative centre, if you want, the administrative body of Irish Freemasonry, the governing body, the sovereign body of Irish Freemasonry. And Grand Lodge of Ireland has met here since 1869. The building was actually made for them. It was made by them and for them. It's a purpose-built building. Grand Lodge of Ireland dates back to 1725. That's the start date we have. Now, it's probably a couple of years older than that. But there's no actual record of the foundation of Grand Lodge of Ireland. We know the building was finished in 1869, but the actual governing body of Irish Freemasonry, Grand Lodge of Ireland, there's no record for its start date. The earliest record we have is a newspaper article from 1725. Now, it's probably a year or two older than that. The oldest Grand Lodge in the world is the Grand Lodge of England, which started in 1717, technically. But, so we don't predate Grand Lodge of England. And we take our start date as being 1725. We're probably a year or two older than that. And Grand Lodge moved in here in 1869.